Olá, boa tarde, sejam bem-vindos, sejam bem-vindas ao evento de indução para a formação de Grupo Temático de Trabalho do Instituto de Estudos Avançados e Estratégicos da UFSCar. Antes de iniciarmos, eu gostaria de pedir desculpas pelos problemas técnicos que enfrentamos, já conseguimos resolver e desculpem por esses 13 minutos de atraso. Hoje nós temos a palestra Crise da Biodiversidade, Biodiversity Crisis. O nosso palestrante será o professor Rodolfo, só um minutinho, perdão, Rodolfo Dirzo. Eu vou ler a biografia do professor Dirzo em inglês, ok? A palestra será proferida em inglês e as perguntas no chat poderão ser feitas em português. Eu procurarei traduzir para o professor Dirzo. Professor Dirzo is an ecologist dedicated to the study of many issues, like ecological evolutionary relationships between species, impact of anthropogenic activities on species interactions on Earth biodiversity, impact of anthropogenic change on ecosystems function and human health. His central inspiration is to develop a research that generates new knowledge about how ecosystems functions and has potential to address some of the crises of the Anthropocene in life support systems. Professor Dirzo has been visiting scholars in different institutions around the world, in China, in Germany, in Mexico. He is co-director of the OSA Golfito Initiative in Stanford. He is senior fellow, Woods Institute for the Environment in Stanford. He's director of a Center for Latin American Studies in Stanford, and many other activities and positions. He also earned many honors. I will just read some many honors. The last honor was Medal Luis Cifuentes, the Mexican Federation of Biologists, and Medal Alson Herrera, Distinguished Scientist, the Universidad Autónoma de Puebla in Mexico. And Professor Dirzo is a very qualified scientist with many publications. So let's go to hear Professor Dirzo. Professor Dirzo, please.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Robert.
It's a tremendous pleasure to have you here, and I give you the voice.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Enquanto nós temos subir os slides, só um lembrete para a nossa audiência. Após, então, a palestra inicialmente do professor Dirzo, teremos perguntas e respostas que podem ser feitas em nosso chat. Finalizado esta palestra, nós teremos um outro evento cujo link será colocado no chat. Aqueles que já se inscreveram têm o link, que é a reunião de pessoas interessadas no grupo temático que nós estamos fomentando a respeito desse tema. Muito obrigado. Professor Dirzo.
Thank you so much. Can you see the screen now? Can you see the screen?
Sim, professor, estamos vendo.
Okay. Thank you so much. It is a great pleasure to be with you this afternoon, my dear friends and colleagues. Parabéns pela iniciativa de organizar este grupo de reflexão, considerações sobre este tema tão crucial para a sociedade inteira. As you know, I am going to be sharing my presentation in English, and so I hope that I can go relatively slow so that hopefully you can follow me. I would like to share some reflections on the phenomenon of biological extinctions. But just give me 1 second. I am going to share my presentation for 1 second. Okay. Let me start with a very macroscopic view and reflection to get us into the topic today. This diagram that you see here in your screen now represents the changes in biological diversity as reflected by the number of genera through the Phanerozoic time. That is to say, through the last 550 million years ago. The red line that you see in the screen indicates the trajectory of biological diversity through this gigantic period of time, the Phanerozoic. And the most evident...
Sorry, professor, estamos sem os seus slides. O compartilhamento foi parado.
Okay, I'm going to try again.
Okay.
Can you see the slides now?
Sim, podemos ver. Pode
okay, continuar. My apologies. So I was starting with this slide indicating the changes in the diversity or diversification of the planet over the last 550 million years ago. That is to say, the Phanerozoic. And as you can see in this red line here going across, indicates the trajectory of diversification of the planet. And the first thing that it is very evident to you is that the trend of diversification of the planet has been to increase, particularly over the last few million years and up to now. So an interesting reflection of this is that we can see that today, at 0 million years ago, that is to say now, the planet is experiencing the greatest diversification that we know has ever occurred, at least during the Phanerozoic. So that's a very interesting phenomenon to think that we are at the same time in which we have the maximum biological diversification of the planet. The other thing that you can see in this slide, there are 5 yellow triangles here that represent the 5 major or mass extinctions that have happened over this period of time, of the 550 million years of life. Also, you can see that despite the fact that in some cases, like in this extinction about 250 million years ago, in which almost all life became obliterated, you can see that the capacity of life has been to be able to come back and to recover. So what we see here is a number of interesting reflections that we can begin to think of for our discussion today. Number one, that mass extinctions are a very rare phenomenon in the history of life. In this slide, as you can see, the average would be about 1 extinction every 110 million years. So that's a very rare phenomenon. It is important to think about the rarity of that, given the fact that we might be actually imposing another mass extinction ourselves. Second point, as you saw, is that recovery, biological recovery, can actually occur. That we can be sure that even if we have another mass extinction, biodiversity will come back. The third reflection is that the recovery times, however, are very long. It takes about, on average, at least for vertebrates, about 10 million years for us to come back to the diversity that we had previous the extinction phenomenon. So we do know that we can go back to have incredible biological diversity, even if we create a mass extinction ourselves, but it will take us millions of years, probably in the order of 10 millions of years of time for recovery. And also, as you know, when we come back and recover biodiversity after a mass extinction, what we recover, what we have, is very different to what we had in the past. So this slide actually brings a conclusion for us to think about, that there is no human consolation for us to think about, given what might be happening today, what is happening today in terms of a mass extinction. So it's a very rare phenomenon. The planet will recover for sure, but the recovery time is going to be in the orders of millions of years, which is irrelevant for us as a species, as a humanity. And also, what will be recovered is going to be very different to what we have today. So really, even if people may argue that we should not worry too much because extinction is a phenomenon of life. I think there is no consolation given what we know about the consequences of mass extinctions. Unfortunately, what we are up to now in this moment is a massive phenomenon of transformation of the planet. It is of such a magnitude that the Nobel Prize of Chemistry, Professor Paul Crutzen, published and invited us to think about the fact that we are now entering a new geological era of the planet. Not the Holocene. In fact, he has suggested that we stop calling this the Holocene and we instead should be calling it the Anthropocene, an era, an epoch in which the impact of human footprint is of such a magnitude that is completely visible and transparent across the globe, and is going to be so for millennia and perhaps for millions of years that we have been impacting the planet so significantly. So the invitation from Professor Crutzen is for us to think about now as the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene has a number of manifestations. In this complicated slide that you see in front of you, the left panel with the orange graphs indicates a number of socioeconomic trends. So these are the things that we as humanity do on the planet. So you can see we have energy use, fertilizer application, the creation of dams, water use, consumption of paper, transportation, and so on. What you can see is that these activities that we do, that we are engaged in actually conducting, have a very clear phenomenon of acceleration. So on the x-axis, you have years, and on the y-axis, you have the magnitude of this phenomena. And as you can see, these socio-economic activities that we do have shown a very dramatic acceleration, particularly over the last few decades. Now, if you turn to the graphs on the right-hand side, and the blue graphs, you can see that there's also associated to these activities a number of manifestations in the Earth systems. And maybe you can see in the slide that most of these variables that we see also accelerating have to do with things that are relevant to climate change. So you see surface temperature, ocean acidification, carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, methane emissions, all of these things that we tend to associate as the clear indicators of the Anthropocene. So the activities that we do on the left-hand side create a number of Earth systems manifestations. But you can see that at the bottom of the slide on the right-hand side, there's also some biological manifestations of the Anthropocene as well. So we have tropical rainforest loss, agricultural land transformation, and biosphere degradation, in this case reflected by the number of species that are threatened. So although we tend to think that the manifestations of the Anthropocene from the point of view of the Earth systems are things mostly related with climate, we can also see that biological things are also being impacted. So it is relevant for us to think about these major drivers of global change from the point of view of biology. So we have the most known, the most publicized climate change, but that's not the only global change. We need to think also about land use change, deforestation, fragmentation, edge effects, those kinds of things. Pollution is another major global environmental change. Needless to say, the population issue is also critical. And last but not least, to me, the most critical global environmental change is biological loss, for reasons that I will be discussing with you in the next slides. So let me very briefly review these other components, and then I will land and more specifically address the biological loss. So starting with climate change, which is the most visible global environmental change, and of course it's a very important one, but it's not the only one, as I said. Well, climate change is very intense and very rapid. Perhaps it's more intense and more rapid since we appeared as a species. And I am sure that you are very well aware of the multiple reflections of this. Let me just show you this slide that indicates the trajectory of changes in the concentration of carbon and how that links to the temperature on the planet. And as you can see, over the millions of years, in the history of life, of the last few millions of years in which we've been able to quantify carbon present in, temperature in our planet, we can see some very significant oscillations. But the thing that I wanted to emphasize for you is that as we move to today, the natural trajectory of climate was to be getting cold, to be going down. Unfortunately, what you know, and as we can see on the left-hand side panel, in the short span of time, there's a dramatic increase in the temperature of the surface of the planet. And in the context of this natural trajectory that the planet was naturally following, which was to become cold as we are present today, actually we're doing exactly the opposite in that direction. And as you know, there's different ways or different manifestations of producing scenarios of climate warming, and some of them are really very dramatic, some of them not so dramatic. So oscillations that might be, depending on what we do going forward, from just 1 degree to perhaps as high as 4 degrees. And of course, all of this is going to be dependent also in the location, on the specific locations of the different locations on the planet. At any rate, climatic change is really a dramatic environmental change, but I want to insist, not the only one. We also have land use change. And of course, now with the technology of satellite imagery, we can have very good pictures about the magnitude of this critical global change, which is land use change. Here's a picture that shows what we have done. Basically, we've changed about 50% of those landscapes that in such a way that they look like this, like what you see in this graph, or as you see in the map on the right, the red indicated transformation, mostly for agricultural production. So this is what we have done for most of the land, for 50% of the land, and the rest, actually, that has not been transformed also looks like this. You have roads, you have shipping routes, you have lights contamination, and so on and so forth. So from the point of view of the macroscopic vision of the planet in terms of land use change, we can see that this is really a dramatic phenomenon as well, independent or in addition to climate change. Another manifestation of land use change is this metric that we know very well, deforestation. And I always like to use this slide put together by the Global Forest Watch to compare changes in the land via deforestation over the longer period. So this is the forest coverage 8,000 years ago, shown in green here. And if we continue with the rates of deforestation and land use change that I showed in the previous slide, the expectation, according to the modeling put together by this group, is that we will end up by year 2050 with a forest coverage like this. Of course, you can imagine that we're going to have secondary vegetation sometimes in a successional trend of recovery, but by and large, the forest that we used to have just 8,000 years ago will be dramatically diminished and reduced to this incredible poor coverage that we have today. So again, climate change is critical, but just look at the potential that we have in terms of creating this major catastrophe in terms of land use change. The next driver that we really need to pay attention to is also the pollution, the toxication of the planet, with chemical pollutants coming at record levels and some of them increasing. So we have the chemical pollutants, but also we need to pay attention to the biological pollutants, such as invasive species. Just one slide, or a couple of slides to illustrate the situation. First, in graph form here, you can see different ways of showing this phenomenon. And in terms of an example more quantitative, the famous dead zones of the planet. These are the areas in which the rivers that have being contaminated and bring all of that contamination to the coastlines, creating these famous dead zones, areas with tremendous eutrophication, with concentration of fertilizers, urban runoff, and so on and so forth, being basically planetary, distributed essentially across the planet, with tremendous concentrations of these eutrophication phenomena. Needless to say, as we begin to pay more attention, this phenomenon of biological pollution, biological contamination, is also dramatic. Not only in the typical sense that we think of invasive species that accidentally have caused some problems in some locations, now some domesticated species are also coming into scene and creating this massive biological contamination as well. And if you think about it, this has a tremendous number of consequences in terms of the functioning of ecosystems, in terms of the disruption of ecological interactions, and so on and so forth. Now, let me very briefly touch on this next driver of global change, obviously, which is the population problem. This is a thing that, numerically speaking, has to do with the fact that we have 7 billion now, and which is likely to increase to maybe 10 billion by year 2050. One critical issue with this is that, in addition to the numbers, is the uneven distribution of resources that come with this increase in population. So here's a graph that shows the dramatic, explosive increase in the human population. But I want to insist, I really want to insist, that the population problem is not only an issue of numbers. It is also critical from the point of view of the very unequal distribution of the resources and the waste of the resources. We could be doing much better, even with the numbers of people that we have today, if we had a much more even distribution of resources and if we were not so wasteful today. But at any rate, this is a combination of critical issues, more societal issues that have to do with numbers, distribution, and waste. And last, we come to the essence of what I wanted to discuss with you, which is biological laws. So the big question is, what is the magnitude, to what extent can we talk about a major pulse of biological laws? Put in other words, as many scientists are suggesting today, are we already entering, or have we already made our way into the 6th mass extinction of the Phanerozoic? Okay, I am going to review this in more detail with you using a number of reflections on this topic. The first one that I want to share is this really horrendous picture that we have put together in a paper published just 1 year ago. This shows the trajectories of biodiversity change. And I don't mean for you to spend much time in trying to look at the details of this graph, but let me just indicate to you that on the left-hand side, we have a number of variables that we have been able to measure. And on the x-axis, we have the magnitude of change in those variables relative to a given baseline. The baseline can be different depending on the variable. But just to illustrate very, very quickly, this horizontal line here, 50, represents a change, a relative change of 50% in each of the variables relative to a baseline. And as you can see, the red sections of the graphs for each of these variables represent the proportion damaged or lost or affected to different degree. The blue represents the situation of no change or non-affected. And as you can see, just in this very quick picture, just very quick vision of this graph showing all of these variables of change, that the red is a predominant phenomenon, in many cases going over the 50% relative change. I'm going to come back to that in more detail in just a couple of slides. Let me preamble. The next thing that I want to go over with you is to put the biological resources, the biota, in the context of the other global environmental changes. And the question here is, what are the impacts of global change, the global change phenomena globally, in terms of biological diversity? And there are a number of interesting tweaks to this that we need to pay attention to. And for the rest of the presentation, I am going to be concentrated, just for the sake of saving time, on 2 particular ones. Terrestrial vegetation, that, as you can see, has been impacted to more than 50%. Basically, the land ecosystems, the terrestrial ecosystems of the planet, impacted by more than 50%. And then this other component, animal life, vertebrate population size, and wild animals, which have been impacted, as you can see from the red sections of the bars, to a very significant extent. Okay, so talking about changes in vegetation on the planet, we have this beautiful metric to measure that, which is the deforestation. Metrics that we can measure with great precision, and we can model and project, and so on and so forth. Those provide a fantastic, a vivid expression of what is happening in terms of the loss of plant life. But unfortunately, that technology that we use for deforestation does not allow us to look at what is happening to fauna with animal life. So I want to be looking also to deforestation and also defaunation. So the combination of the loss of plant life and the combination of animal life as representations of the crisis of biodiversity that we are experiencing today. Okay, so I'm going to try and use this section of drivers of global change to put biological extinction in that context of the rest of the drivers. So the first thing that I want to say is that we need to pay attention to three elements that are, to me, critical. One is that each of the variables that I mentioned to you as important in terms of global change, they do not operate in isolation. They tend to operate in complex interactions among them. That's a very critical point to pay attention to. Second, obviously, we want to look at the consequences of biodiversity loss. In our case, as biologists, as conservation scientists, we're thinking about extinction, changes in the range of distribution of the species, and redistribution of the taxa. And then, of course, more from the point of view of society and policy, is to be interested in understanding what are the ecological consequences of this erosion of the biological diversity. I am an ecologist that works particularly on ecological interactions, so I would say that the disruption of ecological interactions that comes from biodiversity loss is critical, given that it also affects the functioning of ecosystems and also things of relevance for humanity directly, as we will see in the next slides. So let me start with the complex interactions among drivers. This is pretty obvious to you, but I just want to make sure that we're on the same page here. We tend to think that, say, for example, climate change is critical in impacting the planet. We tend to think that pollution is critical to the planet directly. We do know that land use change, ecosystem transformation, and overexploitation are critical for the planet. But what we really need to pay attention to is the fact that all of these variables interact in very, very complex ways. So, for example, population growth and pollution are strongly connected. Climate disruption is connected to ecosystem transformation in both directions, but at the same time, these two interact with the rest of the variables. So just by having this picture here in front of you, you can imagine that the big task that we have in terms of understanding and addressing the biodiversity crisis is that we should not be thinking in terms of each one of the variables of the drivers acting independently. But it's very complex, obviously, to begin to think and to understand and to study and to document the complex interactions of the drivers, but that's a critical agenda that we need to pay attention to. So let me use one simple example to illustrate this idea. And this is going to be an example that combines deforestation, as you see in this sequence of maps here, with the black showing the forest in these different times, and the green showing the transformation into grasslands for cattle ranching in a location in Southeast Mexico. So you can see that this area has been heavily impacted and fragmented by deforestation. So in 1967, the rainforest used to be like this. By year 2000, is restricted to this. And as you can see, tremendous deforestation and gigantic fragmentation. This is a typical image that you will see, for example, also in the Mata Atlântica in your country, in Brazil. It's a typical phenomenon that occurs. You can imagine that if you have a situation like this, deforestation, there's also a problem for animal life, which is the fact that probably many species, as the habitat has been reduced, probably will not have sufficient space for them to maintain viable populations. In fact, we have been able to calculate, what is the area that we need to maintain viable populations of animals listed here in a typical neotropical forest. So, for example, for us, knowing the home range and some aspects of the ecology of the jaguar, we can imagine that we know that we need to maintain 50 individuals in a viable population. Using the number 50, we will need an area of this size, and so on and so forth. So in this graph, I have placed the species going from the smallest here, the rodents, all the way up to the largest animals. And in these names of the species below here, I have separated for you to have a visual of the body size. So the species in black represent species which are small in size, less than 1 kilo. The species in red represent those species that have a biomass of at least 5 kilos. And you can begin to play, assuming that 50 is a decent number to maintain viable populations, but we could play and consider instead 500 and so on and so forth. Considering the case of 50 individuals to maintain viable populations, you can imagine situations like this. In a typical neotropical forest, you would need at least 60,000 hectares to maintain populations that would keep all the contingent of species that you see here. If you reduce your area, so say for example to 1,000 hectares, then you will not be able to maintain viable populations of all of these species, particularly these large-bodied animals. You might be able to maintain from peccaries and smaller animals in this small area. So you can see that reduction of the area decreases the potential of the viability of the species. But you saw also that in addition to the fact that species cannot fit into these smaller areas to maintain viable populations, you can also see in the map that by you doing deforestation and fragmentation, you are facilitating the other driver, the hunting, because now hunters can easily go to areas that used to be inaccessible in the past, like in 1967. Nowadays, it's much easier for hunters to go to the most inaccessible areas of the forest. So you have the combined effect of the hunting, which is now facilitated, and the indirect effect, which is the deforestation and fragmentation. Well, synergies of that nature is really what is creating the major problem in terms of biological erosion, the combination of the drivers. In the particular case of this location that I was mentioning to you, the consequences of combining hunting and poaching with land use change brings about that all of these species that used to be present there up to a few decades ago, now they're biologically, locally extinct in this locality. So we have a very impoverished ecosystem given what we have done with the combined effects of land use change and overexploitation. By the way, you can see that it's the larger species that we are losing, and we've been left only with the smaller species in this system. Okay, another thing that happens in addition to this phenomenon of local loss is changes in the range of distribution of the species. So let me use a graphical model, a caricature, a cartoon to illustrate the situation. Let's consider here on this panel these species that has different populations represented by the blue circles. Here's, in this hypothetical diagram, you have the distribution of these species with its different populations in a gradient of latitude going from south to north, or it could be also a gradient of elevation. You can imagine that situation. Let's suppose that the blue circle encompasses the climatic conditions in which these species and all of its populations can be maintained. Let's now suppose climate change comes in, and then it changes the limits of the distribution in terms of the latitude or in terms of the elevation. And so what used to be the southern range, the southern limit of the range, now is moved to this location. And what you can see is that these marginal populations that used to be healthy and present in the past, now they become to be isolated out of the range and probably doomed to go extinct. On the other hand, you can see that if the range of temperatures or climatic conditions moves to the north, we can have an expansion of the different populations, potentially going in north or going high in elevation. But what you will expect to see is that many populations can actually be lost. Imagine that this is not a collection of populations, but a collection of species, then you will be talking about the loss of species. But either at the intraspecific level, populations of one species, or multiple species, you can see that this phenomenon of climate change is going to create a redistribution and loss of many local species or populations, and some potential perhaps for some of the species to reaccommodate beyond the original range, depending on the specific changes in the temperature. So one amazing researcher from the University of Arizona, Professor Weens, has actually engaged in a gigantic review of the evidence. And he looked at how many species of different groups of organisms, shown here at the bottom, how many species, what proportion of the species in these groups has shown evidence now of being engaged in this contraction of the distribution given climate change. And this is just considering climate change. The point that I wanted to show you here is that the percentage of species in the different groups that have undergone local contraction of the ranges given climate change is really quite significant. So in some cases, it's up to 60%, like in the case of insects. In some fishes, it's more than 60%, and so on and so forth. So on average, maybe you can see that perhaps about 40% of the species in many different groups of plants and animals have already experienced significant reductions in the range contraction given modifications of the climatic envelope in which they became adapted. And so you can imagine that the situation could be that even if we lose some populations or species, there might be the possibility of recovering some others if the range in temperature changes. But this is also assuming that there's no other phenomenon here, which is land use change. Let's suppose that these species could actually move north unless there's also destruction of the habitat there. And as we know, and as I have been insisting, we need to be thinking about not phenomena or drivers of change in isolation, but also in combination. So despite the fact that this data that I showed in the previous slide are so dramatic and so representative of what is happening, they are not complete pictures of what is happening today. These kind of schemes overlooks at least two crucial aspects. Number one, what I have already mentioned, the interaction among drivers. Not only change, but it's going to be also land use change. And second is that we tend to think that species live in isolation, but in fact, species live with other species engaged in a bunch of interactions. So species interactions, the fact that we might move one species might bring about co-extinctions events, ecological release events, situations that we need to take into account when we think about extinctions, not the fact that species are not isolated entities. Very simple examples that you know very well are shown here. In the upper left, you can see that the extinction of these megabirds in New Zealand or in Australia also brought about the extinction of the predators. Once this prey went extinct, obviously the predator went extinct as well. In the famous case of the dodo, once the dodo went extinct, the species, the seeds of what species that was critical for the dispersal by this animal also went extinct. In the case, for example, of the photo shown at the bottom left, in many cases, the lack of top predators creates a predation-free hyperabundance of herbivores that also impacts the vegetation and so on. So we need to think about the fact that we are not going to be losing species or populations in isolation either, because they tend to be interacting with other species as well. Let me come back now to the question of the extinctions per se, which is the thing that almost everybody thinks about when we think about biological loss, the global species loss. We do know that, for example, up to 10,000 years ago, we used to have all of this magnificent megafauna present in the planet. And of course, as you know, all major genera of this megafauna went extinct, in part due to this activity that you see here of humans. More recently, we have documented the extinction of a number of species, getting close to 400 over the last 1500. I'm sorry, since year 1500. And here are some of the examples that many people have as their favorites. So we do know that a number of species have gone globally extinct from the face of the earth. Let's look at the numbers here for 1 second. We do know that since year 1500, we have lost unequivocally 338 species that went extinct. So you might say, well, this is not a big number since year 1500 to now. That is not too bad. But in fact, the problem is that of those 338, almost 200 went extinct since year 1900. That is to say, there has been an acceleration of the extinction process. If we consider the species that are extinct from the species extinct in the wild, plus those species that are endangered of extinction, imminent extinction, the number would be 617. But you might say, well, not too bad. But in fact, out of these 617, almost 480 went extinct just since year 1900. So what I'm saying here is that even if the numbers of globally extinct species look relatively low, what we see is that this phenomenon is occurring at a very accelerated pace, at a very accelerated rate. But I think we need to pay attention to the fact that the global extinction of the species, extinction from the face of the earth, is not the only thing we need to be worried about in the biological extinction crisis. We need to be paying attention to these three sequential stages of the phenomenon of extinction. First of all, we begin with the declines in the local abundance. When that decline becomes extreme, we end up with having range contraction of the species. And then when that happens, we have the extinction of the populations of the species. So let me see if I can illustrate this in graphical form. starting with the declines. Here you have a thing that we published in 2014 using the Live Planet Index, this index that calculates the changes in the relative abundance of the species through time. By using these models here, we calculated that in the last 4 decades, since year 1970 to about 2010, we observed a global decline of about 25% in the abundance of the species of vertebrates. If we break down for the tropical species, that decline was about 50%. So to me, it is dramatic to think that in the last 4 decades, we have induced the decline in 50% of the species, of many species of vertebrates. Unfortunately, the situation is also bad in the case of invertebrates. So look at the LPI again here, the Live Planet Index, now looking at invertebrates. So this is the specific case of the Lepidoptera, and look at the case of the total invertebrates as we can estimate nowadays. So we see a tremendous reduction, a tremendous decline in the abundance of the species. In fact, today, if we take into account both vertebrates and invertebrates in the case of animals, the trend that we see, as published by the WWF in 2020, is a decline of about 65% in the abundance of the species. So a reduction of 65% of vertebrates and invertebrates in the last 4 or 5 decades is a very dramatic phenomenon of biological loss, even though the species might not have gone extinct. Now, when you have those declines in abundance, you're bound to see the contractions in the distribution of the range of the species. And here are 3 examples that I always like to use. What you see in these 3 cases, in blue, is the regional distribution of the species in the African continent. And what you see in red, in these red polygons, are the actual current distribution of the species in those little patches, in these little pockets of maintenance of the species. What this shows, I hope for you, very dramatically, is that even though the 3 species are not globally extinct, they cannot be cataloged as extinct, but the population that they have lost is a gigantic number of them that have become extinct. So I want to emphasize that the critical issue in terms of thinking of a 6th major extinction is not necessarily the extinction of the species, even though this is very accelerated. But the drama really is, the crisis really is in the extinctions of the local populations of many species, as exemplified dramatically in these 3 cases. And you can think of similar cases for the Latin American continent and so on. Now, the last thing that I want to mention in relation to this situation of extinction in the case of animals is that this phenomenon is not homogeneous across the species or across the taxa of the animals. Because we humans, in the kinds of things that we do against these animals, is that we have very clear preferences. For example, we prefer larger animals instead of smaller animals because of more pelt, more meat, more value from the illegal commercial point of view, many reasons why we prefer the larger animals. In addition to that, intrinsic to the ecology and life history of the animals, there's also differences that make the animals differentially susceptible to our impact. Those things can be reflected very well in animal body size, because animal body size represents or is a good proxy for population growth rate or for home range. In other words, animal body size is a good proxy to detect the differential susceptibility of the species to our impact, both of plants and animals, but I am going to be concentrating in animals. Here's a graph that I have used in the past, and probably some of you are already tired of seeing it, but emphasizes my point very clearly. You have here the frequency distribution of body sizes in the Pleistocene, and this was the median body size. Then the mass extinction of these animals occurred in the Pleistocene, and we shifted the distribution now with the median body size to this. So a reduction in the community body size. Nowadays, if we compare the species that are threatened in this yellow histogram versus the species which are not threatened according to the IUCN, you can see also significant difference in the median body size. That is to say, the species that gradually are being left with a given large body size, we are increasingly pushing them to the smaller body size. So what we have now as non-threatened species, those groups of animals that are mostly small-bodied species. And that's a critical phenomenon from ecological and even from medical points of view. Let me emphasize this with a local example that you might know very well. This is data from the amazing tropical ecologist, Carlos Perez, a Brazilian ecologist, Carlos Perez. He estimated the density and biomass of mammals in the Brazilian Amazon, comparing the changes as a function of the intensity of hunting. And as you can see, logically, as you increase this impact hunting, the density and biomass decline. And this is obvious, but that is the case when he considered species with a body size of 5 kilos or more. The interesting and actually fascinating or even shocking thing is that when he looked at the species with a body size of less than 1 kilogram, the trajectories of the responses are exactly in the other direction. What that means is that the density and abundance of small species tends to increase in a situation of human impact. So we can divide the animal communities today, given what we're doing, in two categories: the losers, which are the large species, and the winners, which are the small species. So we're creating a dramatic change in the structure and configuration of the animal communities, given this phenomenon of differential impact. And now, the last thing that I want to do is, because we are preoccupied about the extinction of species, the extinctions of populations, but I think we need to be concerned also, really preoccupied, and in our discussions, in your discussions for the creation of this new entity, we need to be thinking about the extinction or the loss of ecological interactions, not only because that affects the functioning of the ecosystem, but also because it affects also humanity. And let me move on to show one example of this situation in the next few slides. Here you have the situation in which we do know that healthy ecosystems provide services which are critical for us. But one question that we have not explored very well is to what extent healthy ecosystems invoke or promote healthy humanity, healthy life for us humans. And we do know that this is might be a major issue, because we see major deformation, major losses of biodiversity in terms of animal life, as you can see in this slide. We can also know that there is a connection between the presence of wildlife and the situation of disease, because we do know that there are many hotspots of disease emerging and re-emerging infectious diseases. If you look at this map, you can see, you can predict, you can imagine very quickly that the areas of heavy deformation, which are these shown in yellow, happen to coincide also with being areas of very high probability of infectious diseases emerging. So we have a number of locations on the planet, unfortunately, around the planet, to go and examine to what extent the loss of animal life, the loss of biodiversity, can be connected with the proliferation of diseases. At this point, I wanted to ask you, Pedro, perhaps, how am I doing in time? Because I know that we started late and I want to make sure that I don't go too far into the rest of my time. Can you tell me how many minutes do I have to finish? Pedro? Or somebody?
Roberto. If you need 15 minutes.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you. Okay, so let me see if I can connect with examples of the situation here. I'm going to use an example from Africa to look at the connection between our impact on biodiversity, in this case animals, and the risks of diseases. I know that perhaps some of you have already seen some of these, but I will show you some additional data that I have put together for this presentation today. So we've been looking at the situation of animal loss and potential for disease risks in Kenya, where we have established, or we have been using these electrified fences. These huge electrified fences, they're about, and the plots are about 4 hectares in size, are creating experimentally the situation of no animal, no wildlife there, so defaunation. So all of these animals are not present there, but adjacent to those plots, we have the control sites where these animals are present. So this is an experiment in which we are experimentally manipulating wildlife to create situations of defaunation and see what happens with the risk of diseases. The main question that we have is, what is the changes in the abundance of small animals? Because as I told you, small animals tend to be benefited. What are the changes in small animals, such as rodents, when we change from an intact situation to a situation that is deformated? So that's the big question that we've been asking. And we have been using this experimental setup, which is fantastic, but at the same time is a little bit artificial. So in addition to that, of every single rodent that we trap, we collect a number of variables or pieces of information. We collect the ectoparasites, we collect the blood, we collect the hair, and we also mark the animals individually to assess the movement. With the ectoparasites in the blood, we do molecular analysis, DNA analysis, to identify the possible diseases that these animals might carry. So we want to connect the question, if we lose the big animals, are there changes in the small animals? And if those changes are occurring, what are the consequences in terms of the parasites or the pathogens that they might carry? And we do that via molecular analysis. Now, to make a long story short, let me tell you that the molecular analysis has discovered so far this horrendous list of pathogens present in the small animals that we have been collecting in this project, both from the blood and from the ectoparasites. So really gigantic and increasing number of nasty pathogens, going from Bartonellas to plague, for example. The question is, to what extent what we're doing with the wildlife, with the big animals, might be changing the rodents, and what are the consequences of connecting that with the diseases that they carry? So in order for me to do that and show you new data sets, new data that present a much more nuanced situation, comparing not only the exclosures versus the conserved site, but also more real-life situations. Because humans, we humans, not only hunt animals out, but when we do that, we sometimes also bring in other domesticated animals in pastoral systems, and also because in many cases we also do agriculture in addition to killing of animals and things like that. So what I'm going to show you is a couple of slides to try and illustrate in a more realistic situation what happens when you lose the animals, either in a very controlled manipulational experiment, comparing conserved versus exclosures, or when you compare pastoral systems versus conserved locations, or when you compare croplands, agricultural lands, versus conserved locations. So we have four kinds of situations of human activities, and let's see what happens with the rodents. First thing that I want to show you in this graph here is that something that might be a little bit difficult to see, but I want to really quickly illustrate for you what the situation is. So you have here the four different disturbances that we have been looking at compared to the conserved situation. The different colors here represent the different species of small mammals, all of them potential hosts of the many diseases that I showed you in the previous slide. The point that I want to draw your attention to here is that if you were to look at the different colors, you can see that essentially in the four conditions, we have basically the same colors. That is to say, we do not see major changes in the species, in the richness of species. But what we do see, and it's very clear here, is that the relative abundance of different species do change dramatically. So even though the species richness is not of rodents is not changing very much, what is the relative abundance of different species changes very dramatically. And of course, as you can imagine, that kind of information is critical if we do know that the different species of rodents carry different diseases, and the different species of rodents have different preferences for the different types of land use. So you can begin to imagine how complex the situation of us understanding changes in biodiversity, in this case the mammals, and the risks for disease. So let me illustrate the situation with this example here. I think it's going to be a relatively complex figure, but I'll walk you into the details of this. You're going to see the effects of the types of disturbance that I mentioned, wildlife loss, comparing with the defonated sites, cropland sites, pastoral sites, all of these compared to the control site. And I'm going to use the example of 5 diseases only. So the question is, how does the abundance of these rodents change depending on the type of disturbance and the type of diseases that they might carry? Let me see if I can illustrate that. So here's first the example of the situation in which we remove the animals experimentally by placing these electrified fences. And the 5 diseases that I showed you are shown here. So you can see that relative to the control situation, for this disease, you see an increase of this magnitude in animals that are infected with this disease, Borrelia. For this disease, the increase is a little bit higher. For this disease, hepatozoon, the increase in the number of animals infected with this pathogen is really quite significant. But that's in the case in which we just remove the big animals. Now, let's look at the situation when we are, in addition to the defaunation, there's also the cropland system. There's agricultural activities as well. You can see that it's similar to the wildlife removal, but in fact, it is not quite the same. So you see that this disease increased much more than in the other case. You can see that hepatozoon here, that used to be dramatically high in the wildlife removal, in this situation is also high, but not as high. You can see that this other disease, in this case, in these cropland systems, is much higher than in the wildlife removal system. So you can see that there's a similar response, but you can see that the different diseases change in the relative representation given the abundance of the rodents that respond differently to the different types of agricultural or management activity that we do. Let's look finally at the pastoral systems. And this is an incredible result that I was so surprised to see. You can see that these 5 diseases now are not so abundant. The animals infected with these diseases are not so abundant. And in fact, many of them do not significantly differ from the control situation. In other words, my friends, what I'm trying to say is that the type of land use, in addition to the defaunation, combines itself to create different responses depending on the pathogen that you're looking at. So really, for us to understand the changes in biodiversity, the biodiversity alterations that we're doing, how are they going to be translated in diseases? It's a very nuanced, complex situation because it depends on whether rodents are more abundant in the croplands or in the wildlife removal or in the pastoral systems, and also depends on what diseases they carry. Furthermore, we can see that there is an extremely idiosyncratic site rodent climatic dependence. It's a very nuanced situation. So I want to finish by saying that if we want to address these questions of the crisis of biodiversity, there's a number of broad things that we need to be thinking about. My one initial comment is that we will need to stop extinction. And please, I want to emphasize that by extinction, I don't mean the global extinction of the species only. We need to stop the extinction of the local populations because that is relevant for the local people and for the loss of many species at the local level. Also, from the genetic point of view, it's very critical to stop the extinction of the populations. For us to be able to do that, we need to be engaged in reduction or stop the destruction of the habitat where the species occur, be that plants or be that animals, and so on. We need to be able to control the overexploitation of the animals. Why is it that we're still doing overexploitation of animals for trade, for pelts, for the illegal trading business, and so on? We should be able to stop that. That should not be a very difficult policy that we, global society, should be able to implement. The next point for your discussions, I think, might be relevant is that we really need to think in addressing the biodiversity crisis to promote education and work which is multidisciplinary. It is no longer the case for ecologists or geneticists or evolutionary biologists to be working separately. We need to be working together across disciplines, but we also need to be working together with disciplines of the social and humanities sciences as well. This is a really critical issue if we want to address the situation. Now, from the point of view of wildlife that I've been emphasizing in my last slides, I think that we need to begin to think about rewilding. We need to be thinking about refaunation. Just as we have become good in doing reforestation, we need to be thinking about doing refaunation. And my last slide is for people to begin to think, or for us to begin to think, especially the young people, what you individually can do. So the first thing that I think we need to come into grips with is that we need to spread the word that these are critical phenomenon. Global environmental change, connection with biodiversity, is a really critical issue of the Anthropocene today. And we need to engage the citizenship, the citizenry, and also the public and also the children for them to become aware of the situation. We do know that we have very limited areas protected, NPAs, natural protected areas, but those that we have, and you guys in Brazil have extensive areas, so I think it's critical to make sure that we can maintain some good representation of protected areas and also the conservation efforts by the local people. Third, I think it's critical for countries like yours and certainly for this country, as we have a society which is educated about these issues, we need to be insistent in the moment of the elections to vote for leaders that are committed to biodiversity, to maintain the biodiversity of our planet. I have a fourth point that has to do with the diet of humanity now. I don't mean to say that we need to stop eating meat completely, but I think we can do a reduction of meat consumption, and certainly we can reduce or eliminate the trading of wildlife products. My second to last point is coming back to the population problem. I think that it is critical for us to think that the population is not only the numbers of people, it is also the situation of unequal distribution of the resources, with countries that have a lot and countries that do not have much or nothing, or sectors within countries that have a lot and sectors which do not have anything. And of course, the problem of the waste of resources. The waste of resources is a really, really significant issue that we have to deal with. And all of these would not be having any impact, unless we do not pay attention to women empowerment. And this is particularly critical in terms of what we're seeing in this country, the US, addressing precisely the opposite situation. The women empowerment is critical for us to address the population problem. And the last point that I want to bring in your reflection for today is that we still have some bits of nature here and there. And in Brazil, we actually have quite significant representations of nature. I hope that we can enjoy it and love it before it's too late, and we can engage as many as possible in this critical issue of humanity today. So I want to thank you for your attention, and I apologize for the long time I have taken and for the problems, technological problems at the beginning. Thank you so very much for your attention. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Dirzo. It's amazing, brilliant, and insightful. And I will add one opinion, scaring information you provide us this afternoon. As an industrial engineer, I am figuring out how important it's to bring this kind of information you provide us to new generation of engineers to think the impact of our activities, the human activities, industrial human activities on Earth, on biodiversity.
But Roberto, can I respond to your comment, which I think is very important?
Of course, sure.
Well, what you're saying precisely represents one of the critical points that I wanted to make at the end. We need to work in conjunction. We need to work together. We need to hold hands academically, intellectually. Otherwise, we in biology are not going to be able to address these issues if we don't have the communicators, the engineers, the social scientists working together. This is really a crisis that needs to be addressed in a crisis mood as well. We need to be paying attention to these phenomena collectively, holding hands together, to put it in a simple way.
Yes. Any of the drivers, all drivers you show us, you have a different kind of professionals, people working. So you have economic drivers, you have political drivers, you have all, because our human activities provoke and cause this unbalance on.
Yes.
So let's gonna start with our audience questions. Okay.
Thank you.
First questions from Janie Falkowski. She said, "Good afternoon." And Janie would like to hear, Professor, your opinion on the interplay between biodiversity crisis and cities crisis. She also asks if the sustainability principles can handle the catastrophic scenario that Professor presented us.
So if I understood correctly, Roberto, is about the cities, urban?
Yes, the interplay between biodiversity crisis and city crisis. You have the interrelationship between them.
Yes. Well, it is actually multifaceted. It has many connections, many interplays that are relevant to pay attention to. On the one hand, there is a situation of perception of the nature of the problem. Because many of us live in cities, sometimes in big cities, Sao Paulo, Mexico City, big cities, we tend to think that these problems that are happening with biodiversity in more natural systems is detached, is not connected to what we might experience. But my friends, just looking at the case of this pandemic that we're dealing with, who would have thought that perhaps, as this hypothesis now, this virus that is present in bats or in pangolins might go to a market, and then from a market was passed on to a human. That human, during the transportation to a big city, then another big city, and then all of a sudden, given the mutation rates and capacity of change in this virus, we have 2 years plus of dealing with this pathogen, given the fact that something happened in a remote location where the evolutionary ecology of bats and pangolins has created resistance to these viruses that then by the contact in a city, in a market, in the Wuhan market, for example, and then the human activities moving from place to place bring about this catastrophe of a pandemic situation. I totally understand that we are not 100% sure that that was the origin of this pathogen, but we do know that pangolins and beets have alpha and beta coronavirus with a contingent of similarity to the SARS-CoV-2 of 96% in the genome. So if this was not the reason today, my friends, chances are that it's going to be the next one if we do not pay attention to these connections between what is happening with biodiversity in nature and what is happening with societies in cities. On the other hand, it is very important now that we begin to understand that cities can also be relevant in terms of at least appreciation and even the psychological well-being of people that have an opportunity to enjoy biodiversity in cities. And so the connections are multiple, and the cities also are the places for education of many young communities. So there's intellectual, psychological, and ecological connections that are relevant in terms of the interplay between urban settings and more wild, so to speak, or more undestroyed or more or less conserved sites around the world.
Thank you, Professor. Next question comes from Pedro Galetti, your friend.
My friend Pedro.
Thank you for the very nice talk. What about reconciliation ecology? Is it a feasible way to combine the human needs and the biodiversity needs?
Yes, that is sort of the 10 million question, Pedro. But I think that we can no longer consider this as antagonistic situations. First of all, I think we need to come into grips with the knowledge and acceptance of the fact that we have already done a lot of damage to biodiversity, but there's still a lot that can be done to prevent further damage. So the transformation of massive agricultural production to more local and diversified agricultural production is one way. The combination of agro-silvo-pastoral systems in which you have different types of management in a given land use change modification, that can happen. The idea, Pedro, of landscape mosaics, areas in which you have areas that are really dedicated to the conservation of nature, adjacent to areas that are dedicated to sustainable use and agricultural and benefit of society, productive activities, I mean. Then buffer zones intermediate to prevent the heavy impact on the core areas of protection. This idea of the biosphere reserves in which you have different, it's called a zonation. You allocate your landscape into different types of use which are pertinent, including the conservation of nature in some locations. We need to make sure, Pedro, that the areas that we have impacted dramatically do not cause the movement of wildlife from those locations into urban settings, coming back to the connections with urbanization, because many of these animals, as we know, can carry pathogens as well. So I think there is a tremendous potential for the reconciliation between biodiversity conservation and and human well-being. In the ultimate situation, Pedro, ultimately, we can think of the fact that, we do really depend on biodiversity. We eat biodiversity to start with. We depend on biodiversity, air, clean waters, and so on, what is in general called ecosystem services, are really essential for us. So the connection, the reconciliation for us, not so much, I would say, in terms of the academic institution, but in the sense of us being able to communicate to that need to the policymakers today, I think is absolutely essential. We need to bring this reconciliation not only in the understanding of the scientific and academic community, but also in the general public, particularly the policymakers, particularly the elected officials that that have the capacity to make the decisions that govern the ways of acting of society in general. I think that in the ideas that you're going to be discussing about this thinking group, this working group, the capacity to engage and being able to communicate to the policymakers is a really critical issue, especially in the context of bringing into the understanding that we're dealing with two complex systems. One is the biological complexity that I addressed today, and the other one is the social complexity. And so there's ways now, intellectually speaking, of addressing, the technical aspects of engaging those types of complex systems to address the issues. We need to understand that we're dealing here with complex systems, not only from the point of view of biodiversity, but also from the point of view of society. To the extent that we can make these two overlap, we can have some hope that we can do things for the benefit of humanity and for the conservation of both aspects of our planet, of our life.
Okay, thank you, Professor. Next question from Luciano Lopes. Thanks for the brilliant speech. Strategically, in your opinion, which the scientific actions could lead us to biodiversity conservation?
It seems to me, pleasure to see that you're here, Luciano. We need to think about the interplay of the different drivers of a global change. Under normal circumstances, we would say we need to stop climate change. Of course, we need to stop climate change, but we need to address the situations that the challenges that climate is bringing in connection with land use change and in connection with the invasive species and so on. So really, to me, strategically, what I think is essential, is critical, is that we begin to think about addressing the drivers of change in a synergistic manner. In other words, we need to come into grips with the idea that is not very productive. It has not been very productive to address the different drivers of change independently. We need to come with modelists. We need to come with social scientists to together define the priorities in conjunction, paying attention to the fact that the drivers have different idiosyncrasies, different characteristics, how they engage, how they intermingle. That to me is the strongest priority. I don't mean to say that people who are engaged in modeling climate change, for example, should stop doing the science. No, I don't mean that. What I mean is that for those colleagues that are specialized in that, to be able to work together with the people who work on the biodiversity components, who work on the communication, who work with the policymakers, to work together and bring that central aspect of the fact that this is a combined interplay of situations rather than be tackling one at a time. To me, strategically speaking, would be the thing that we should be paying attention to. And of course, educational systems, universities and academic institutions have a lot to do in this regard in terms of beginning to think about classes and courses and programs of PhD and masters to be as collaborative and as interdisciplinary as possible. By the way, if at some point, Roberto or Pedro, you would be interested, I'd be more than happy to share the concept that Stanford is developing for a new mega program of sustainability. That is to say, not ecology, not earth systems, not social sciences separately, but in a conjunction of the programs coming together to a major school of the same level of the School of Humanities and Sciences. That is a thing that I think is a movement that many academic institutions are beginning to pay attention to. And that goes to your question, Luciano.
Well, thank you, Professor. That's interesting and very, very, how can I say, I forget, but what a kind of initiative do you need? Because to address these complexities, we need to put all together, all knowledge together in order to build a collective intelligence to handle the problems and to come up with the solutions.
Yeah. And so, Roberto, we'll be more than happy to send you the link of the concept that Stanford has developed about that. I mean, I don't mean to say that this is going to be the model, but at least the elements that have been contemplated to address this issue of interdisciplinarity is actually called the New School of Sustainability.
Good. You can provide us the link through our private site in StreamYard.
Okay.
So you're gonna publish it on YouTube chat. Okay.
I will try now, but I'm afraid that I might actually do something.
If you can't do it, you can send us later by email.
Yeah.
Then you publish in your website. Okay.
Fantastic.
And you're gonna send by mail to all people who register to this speech.
Okay, fantastic, excellent.
Okay.
I will do. Excellent.
So let's go. Let's move. Mariana Peso asks you. I've seen Professor Dirzo is involved in scientific education programs. I'd like to hear him about the role of such programs and also communication efforts in fighting biodiversity loss. And she make another question. The next, please, Paulo. And how to communicate the data concerning disease regulation you have shown us, considering this risk. Okay.
Wonderful questions, Mariana. Very, very important questions, really, quite significant. Let me tell you a little bit of the things that I do myself as an example of the commitment that I think people can take now to address the question of communication. I am particularly interested in the youth, in the young people, because I have the impression that they can be very important ambassadors for us to transmit this this situation that we are beginning to understand today. I took the example that this young lady from Sweden, I'm sure you know the name, Greta Thunberg, this amazing lady who has been able to communicate in a spectacular manner the problem of the climate. Well, I would say that we would need multiple Gretas or Marianas or Marias or any Portuguese or Spanish name that would be the ambassador of biodiversity. So there is a big asymmetry, Mariana, that you have seen, that we have put a lot of attention on the climate situation, which of course is relevant. I don't mean to minimize that, but that unfortunately has not had a parallel in terms of publicizing, bringing to the understanding of society in general, the crisis of biodiversity. So my intention in doing these educational programs for kids is to hopefully have them as ambassadors. Even if they don't become Greta Thunbergs, they can talk to the parents, or they can talk to the relatives, or they can talk to the classmates in their schools. So I am hoping this might be, like John Lennon said, you may think I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one, in which we're trying, I am dreaming of the possibility that having a youth that is going to come with us to be on top of these things as well. And I say that because, unfortunately, as well, many of the burdens that we are creating with this crisis, environmental crisis and social crisis, are going to be impacting the youth and the next generation. So we really need to be working with them as effectively as possible. What I am doing in a personal setting, but that's completely personal, is in this part of the country, there's a lot of immigrant families, mostly from Latin America, as you can imagine. And so my programs of education have to do with these kids that have not had as many opportunities as the local kids. And so I have a program which is called STEM, which means science, technology, engineering, mathematics for Latino girls, and I bring the girls to Stanford to understand and appreciate science. I don't mean to say that all of them are going to become scientists, but at least they're going to be able to talk to their parents and appreciate the significance of science. And and then what I think is critical here is that if we want to communicate these things, Mariana, probably we ourselves are not going to be the best communicators. We might want to work with professional communicators. And I think we need to begin to engage with communicators, explain what we have understood about disease, for example. You see how many complex graphics I try to explain to you guys. Well, transmitting that to a more general public is really very challenging. And I try to do my best whenever I can, but I think we need professional people who should be able to help us in communicate these messages better. Again, coming back to the point that Roberto and I have been mentioning, that we need to work in collaboration with other people, including good communicators. There's a profession there which, you know, I wish I had those capacities, but I think that we can extend our arms and hold arms with them for them to help us communicate these critical issues.
Mariana also asked, some researchers say we should not scare people too much otherwise. The absence of hope will prevent behavior change. Do you agree, Professor?
Good question, Mariana. I agree in part. I think that presenting a scary situation with no hope is not very, might not be all that productive. But I have this dilemma myself. I think that we scientists have a clear responsibility, I'm going to use an English expression, of telling it like it is. In Spanish, it would be, hay que decir las cosas tal como son. We need to tell it like it is. No sugarcoat, no anesthetics here. I think we need to, unfortunately, convey to the general public what is happening. I know that this can be impactful and have a negative perception on the people about things being bad. But I think if we do not appreciate that, if we do not appreciate the magnitude of the problematic, I think we're going to be in a difficult situation to address how to deal with that situation. On the other hand, I think it is important at the same time to bring within these messages examples of situations that clearly provide lots and lots of hope about things that can be done. So unfortunately, and I apologize for this today, that I understood from my friend Pedro that I should address the crisis of biodiversity, and I did not address much more the things that can be done and the hopeful examples. But I can tell you, in Latin America, for example, there are many indigenous communities, and I want to emphasize indigenous communities, that have provided incredible, compelling evidence of sustainable forest management, for example. There are many communities, and there's at least one book that I know, and I'll be more than happy to share the reference of for you, that shows successful cases of integrated use of biodiversity and use it in the sense of being productive in terms of revenue, in terms of economic revenue, and also protection of nature at the same time. So there are a number of examples. There are a number of examples also of recovery of very dreadful situations of almost extinction of species that have been brought back to decent numbers and so on. So I partly agree with you that it is terrible to present messages without the complement of what can be done and what are the good examples that can be, give us hope and give us motivation to do things. So let me put it in a simple way. I think it's our responsibility to tell it like it is, decir las cosas tal como son, but at the same time, I think we have a responsibility of providing evidence that things can be done. So I would like to say in closing, I am preoccupied, but at the same time, I am occupied in providing both the evidence as is and also the examples of hope.
Great. Amazing words, Professor. Very good message. And we must get engaged in solutions. Solutions in Brazil, we have a lot also. We need to show, to disclosure those solutions, because people like to sell the scare.
Yeah.
Because you go to the news, you get scared if you just pay attention to the facts. So that's great.
Right.
Let's move on. Eliana Leite asks you, what do you think about biodiversity and ecosystem services? Language to we researchers talk with the public managers or decision makers about biodiversity conservation?
Eliana, it's a very challenging question again. There is this contention that I have seen in the scientific community, excuse me, in the sense that some colleagues of mine, some colleagues that I respect very, very, very much as scientists, that say that putting, ecosystem services, and more specifically putting value in terms of monetary value to biodiversity, can provide an incorrect image, in the sense that we tend to economize from the point of view making an economic perspective into the intrinsic value of things. For example, these colleagues say that every single species that has evolved after 4 billion years of evolution is a miracle of life on the planet, and every single species deserves to be conserved, even though those species might not provide, say, food or something tangible in terms of economic value. So there is this question between the intrinsic value of nature and the economic value of nature. In between that situation is this idea of ecosystem services, that we should be paying attention to biodiversity and nature because of the benefits that it provides to us. It seems to me that appreciating nature because of the miracle of evolution, because of those things represent, imagine this situation, 4 billion years of trial and error evolutionary processes to be present today is a cosmic miracle. It's an incredible thing. But at the same time, many people, particularly in some sectors of society, need to see or want to see something more tangible. And the example that I have been using, and that's why typically when I do a presentation like today, I tend to bring the question of disease or the zoonosis at the end, because my hope is that people will pay attention to something that is so tangible, such as disease and pandemics and so on, that is so vivid in our thinking, in our imagination today, that perhaps those kinds of things, make us think of elephants and giraffes and tapirs and antas and onzas, not only as decoration of the planet, but also as things that have an important regulating function in terms of preventing major problems, such as the triggering or the spills of pathogens creating pandemics and endemic diseases. So I really appreciate the perspective of my colleagues who say that there is an intrinsic value in nature, psychological, emotional, educational per se, but at the same time, some people only feel motivated to appreciate that beauty when they consider what is the significance for them in terms of the services. So that's why this idea of ecosystem services has become so popular, so engaged so many people in the world, by thinking that what we have with those things is economic value, is some value for society, for the well-being of humanity. Disease regulation is the example that I use because it's very ecological, and because we cannot value, the well-being of people. The well-being of people is something intrinsic that we should be always fighting for. And I think health, human health, and prevention of diseases is something that might attract or might bring attention to the people who not necessarily thinks of biodiversity as something with an intrinsic value.
Okay, let's go. Next question, Cynthia Gomes. When it comes to the potential of cities to reverse the biodiversity crisis, would it be possible to point out which would be more effective urban urban forests and urban parks?
Cynthia, I think your question actually poses the response in and of itself. It seems to me that that it would be nice not to go in urban versus non-urban. I think that the combination of both would be what could be the best message that we can provide. And I want to say that particularly because in countries such as this, where I'm sitting now, there is this other question of environmental justice, which is to say that many environmental problems particularly impact underserved communities. You know, communities of Latinos, communities of African Americans, minorities in general, what they call in this country underserved communities. And I think for those communities, going to parks in remote locations, you know, here in this country is a famous Yellowstone Park and so on. Not many people can go to those situations, unfortunately, today. And so to the extent possible, if there are urban parks that will inculcate in people the appreciation and fascination of nature, that combined with the possibility in some cases of urban parks, of nature parks, could be a good combination. Ideally, I imagine that having the two things together would be the best thing to help to contribute to society, to the extent possible within urban areas, and to the extent possible that combined, not alternatively, but combined with the possibility of promoting facilities for those communities to also have access to nature parks as well. And your question is really very critical because nowadays there is very good evidence, mostly coming from the psychology disciplines, that indicate that some degree of contact with nature can have very positive impacts, emotionally speaking, psychologically speaking, in people. Studies in hospitals, studies in people who are isolated because of some disease and so on. So bringing attention to the extent possible, or bringing facilities to be in contact with nature, even within urban areas, and ideally urban areas with natural areas and natural forest parks, would be the ideal that we should aspire to provide to society at large. That's my view.
Okay, thank you, Professor. Another question from Alexandra Pinto. Alexandra Pinto, perdão. How do you see the role of cinema, television, and media in general, considering this situation?
Very good point, Alexandra. It seems to me that that is a powerful communication tool. Unfortunately, as you know, cinema has had a predilection for movies which are not necessarily very educational, movies which tend to emphasize a lot of violence and so on. But I mean, there has been some efforts that have been very educational and have had an impact. There's some study, for example, about this recent movie about the asteroid that was supposed to crash on Earth. I've forgotten the title of the movie now. I've seen it at least once, in which a group of scientists tried to convey this danger to policymakers, and the policymakers do not pay attention to the danger that is impending, on the planet. So those movies that bring attention to the combination of the scientific advice or the scientific understanding of situations being popularized in movies, as long as they are, you know, as well done as possible with the scientific facts very carefully taken care of, it seems to me that that could be a very powerful instrument to promote conservation of nature. We have seen the tremendous impact that some movies have had in some aspects of society, in many cases negative responses, unfortunately, but I think the potential is there for many movies and productions, and cinematic productions, to also have positive impacts as well. So, you know, we are in such a desperate situation in which anything that provides, that helps, that has potential to make us understand what is at stake is really critical. I am imagining, for example, because I find it very difficult for me to convey, even in scientific settings, this idea. You know, we tend to think that the planet, what we do about nature, is to save the planet. I think, for example, that message is a message that is commendable, that is relevant, but at the same time is not quite precise. It's a little bit incorrect in this sense. We do know, and that was my first slide actually, we do know that after major biological catastrophes, major holocausts like the 5 extinctions, biodiversity will come back. We do know that, but it takes millions of years and it will be very different to what we had before. So really this idea of let's save the planet, actually the real existential problem with the planet is Homo sapiens. The planet, I can assure you, we have 5 examples, 5 experiments that have occurred that show that the planet will come back. Biodiversity will come back, but it takes a long time and it's going to be very different to what you used to have before the extinction. But humanity, the species Homo sapiens, that is to me where the existential problem really lies. If we, I mean, I have difficulty in communicating this even in my scientific sphere. If we could communicate this broadly, you know, I think that would have a better appreciation for society. That, or the beauty of the planet as well, to communicate it massively via movies, it would be very important. I suspect, for example, that this British communicator, his name is David Attenborough, from the BBC of London, who has made all of these amazing documentaries, has had a very positive impact, at least in the society of the UK, of the Great Britain, in terms of appreciating nature. I think that that is another instrument that we should consider using for the benefit of what our mission is.
Okay, we go to the last 2 questions. One from Alexandre, another from Maria Fátima Silva. Alexandre asks, Professor, human population control is something that seems absent from political debates in the West. Health distribution aside, shouldn't this be considered in order to mitigate the decline in global systems? And he completes his questions adding, or this topic is simply too hot or too touch? How can we even begin to have this conversation, given the moral panic that ensues at the mere mention of, for example, humans' right to abortion?
Yeah, that, Alexander, is a very, very pertinent question, actually. It seems to me that, you know, there have been very significant attempts. One of them is just 2 offices behind me, Professor Paul Ehrlich and his wife, Anne Ehrlich, who some decades ago came up with the book, The Population Bomb, talking about precisely the problem of the inertia of the human population to grow explosively like a bomb. That, you can imagine the tremendous impact that it had, mostly from the point of view of criticizing it, or from the point of view of being negative against that perspective that this professor tried to convey. What I think now would be an approach that that would be perhaps more palatable to policymakers and for society at large, is to consider that the population problem is not only the numbers. I think that I did not explain properly, although I tried in my presentation, because it has 3 angles to it. First angle is the numbers per se, right? I mean, you saw that graph that shows the explosion of the population, of the human population. But that comes together with this question of inequity of distribution of resources. Let's think about this. There are countries, and unfortunately I'm sitting in one of those, in which there is such a tremendous availability of resources, or there are sectors within countries, even in this country, with tremendous accessibility of resources versus countries or sectors within countries that have no accessibility of resources, be that water, be that food, for example, right? If we were engaged in a situation of making a really dramatic effort, a really decisive effort in bringing equality to a much better situation, that would be one effective way of addressing the problem, because then people with better education, better opportunities about the situation of fertility is going to be paying attention to that as well. Then there is the problem of the waste of resources. Many countries and many sectors of countries just simply throw away food, for example, and it's a tragedy for humanity. And third, coming to the question of fertility, it is absolutely essential that that women are empowered. And unfortunately, I mean, who would have thought in this country where I'm sitting now, just last Friday, a major blow to that situation came about with the restriction of the Roe versus Wade that just happened here. So I can tell you this is going to be a battle that is going to take effort, coordination, and communication across society at large. So I think now we all have a responsibility to bringing attention to the fact that women empowerment, for them to decide, for them to have their reproductive rights used completely, is absolutely essential. That associated to the question of inequality, inequity, I mean, how can it be that that we have societies as contrasting as we have today in terms of well-being? And then all of that, I think, is going to impinge and have positive consequences on the explosive numbers in the population today.
Okay, Professor, I said one more last question, but I made a mistake. My apologies, Anna Lessinger. My apology, Anna Lessinger. She made she wrote a question on chat. So I apologize, Professor. We have two more questions. Anna Lessinger asking you how to promote reformation and deal with biological contamination at the same time.
Wow, Anna, all of you guys ask beautiful but very challenging questions. Let me start with the reformation situation. This is an important agenda for us in the scientific community, but not in isolation from other disciplines. I just had a participation about 10 days ago with another Brazilian group of colleagues from Brasilia, thinking about the question of reformation. To make a very long story short, let me see if I can summarize what I think are the critical issues. You know, we have been engaged. It took us decades to become able to do reforestation. I think we're in a hurry. We need to become capable and savvy about doing reformation. The things that need to come that I think we need to pay attention to include the following. Number one, what is the source of animals to bring back to the location where you want to do the rewilding? That's number one. Number two, what level of genetic diversity the group of animals you're bringing needs to have? That is a question that people like Pedro Galetti would be, you know, member of a team to address this issue. Point number three, one would need to make absolutely sure, being extremely picky about making sure that these animals have had the appropriate quarantines so they will not bring any pathogens into the community that you're trying to bring them up to. Next, really essential, is what are the conditions of the habitat where you are going to be bringing the animals into? If you bring animals into a location where the habitat, the carrying capacity, to put it in technical terms, is not good enough, the project is not going to function. And last, but definitely not least, and this is to me the most critical one, is we need to engage the local communities where these programs are going to be implemented to be part of the issue, to be part of the program, to be part of the experiment. I have seen in my experience, which is mostly in Latin America, a little bit in Africa, but mostly in Latin America, those attempts that have not paid attention to the local community, who have not brought the community into the co-design, into the thinking of how to do this. And if communities are not engaged, if the communities do not embrace the project, do not consider themselves as part of it, if they don't see the benefits of it, my prediction is that those reformation attempts are going to fail. So I think it is absolutely essential that we engage in those steps that are critical, but the last one that I mentioned is absolutely essential. So as you can see, it is a question of technical aspects, going from the genetics to the epidemiology to the ecology, and also the social scientists, the communicator, the extensionists, the MDs, to make sure that these things actually take good hold with the participation of the local community. In case your question was also contemplating the possibility of this idea that has come up recently within the area of synthetic biology, meaning particularly the de-extinction, that is to say, the bring back extinct species, to me, that is an interesting idea, but it's one that is very challenging. So, you know, the idea of bringing back mammals and mastodons and gomphotheres that went extinct in the Pleistocene, to me, that's an idea that I would be very careful about contemplating and playing with. So the other things that I mentioned would be what I would suggest.
Okay, now the last questions by Maria Fátima Silva. Your comments on forests in Brazil and North America in 2050 with the increase of temperature, which will feel more, in your opinion? There is an
yeah, there's a mistake.
I think since the temperature difference is very large in both areas.
Okay, good question, Maria Fátima. I think that that those latitudes, northern latitudes, or further from the equator latitudes, are going to be impacted more significantly, according to all the models that we have seen. All general circulation models that we have seen do indicate that the temperature per se is going to be increasing proportionally much more significantly as you move away from the equator, both north and south. So it is potentially predictable that northern latitudes ecosystems are going to be impacted more significantly. But again, I want to insist, Fátima, that we need to pay attention to the fact that it's not only climate. Climate is going to come up together with land use change. Let us suppose that, you know, in the northern latitudes, climates are going to be impacted the most. So many species probably, or many ecosystems, might have a tendency to displace themselves and migrate further north or further south to potentially compensate the changes in temperature. But they will not be able to do that if the land use change has impacted those areas. And they, even if they could potentially migrate and readjust by movement in latitude or in elevation, they might not be able to do so if land use change has already impacted the potential sites for them to occur. Even if they were to occur there, if, for example, a critical species is part of that system that is going to be trying to readjust given climate, if the pollinator, for example, is not there, if the pollinator does not migrate with a species of plant that is critical to that system, then the plant will not be able to migrate. So in general terms, we do see from the GCM models that the northern latitudes and southern latitudes are going to be impacted much more significantly. There is the question that climate in and of itself is not going to be operating individually. It's going to be operating with other systems. That being said, though, we need to pay attention to the fact that these high latitude places are going to be, according to the models, very significantly impacted. So whatever we can do now before it's too late, we should be engaged in that. But, you know, we have known about these things for a number of decades. I want to insist that being able to communicate what is at stake becomes critical, not only in the scientific and technical aspect, but also in the social aspects of the issue that we have in front of us.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor, for your brilliant speech and your insightful and very clear answers to our audience. The audience engagement was also amazing. Thank you, everyone that attended this conference. Nice to meet you, Professor. Thank you very much for your time. We wait for your email with information you want to share with our community, okay?
Yes, and also, Roberto, I have a paper that just came out like 4 days ago in the Proceedings of the Royal Society that actually provides, in some sense, a summary of many of the things that I covered today. I will be more than happy to share it with you, also for distribution with the community.
Muchas gracias, professor.
Um prazer.
Muito prazer.
Grande prazer.
Muito gusto.
Muito gosto.
Hasta luego.
Grande abraço para vocês.
Muito obrigado. Eu quero agradecer a todos os presentes que estiveram aqui, e agora nós temos a nossa reunião com quem está interessado em compor um grupo temático sobre o assunto apresentado. Muito obrigado, até logo. Nos vemos em breve.